Alright, so we just 1 second ago realised that I didn't have a seat, and we have now solved this problem. So here we are. So we are here today to talk to you about the climate crisis and what that has to do with service design. Rob is a service designer at the Satellite Applications Catapult. And Rob's here to kind of be the voice of somebody with a design practice who's focused on sustainability. Theo Nadupin is an innovation director at Shift, a social change agency. And Shift have done a lot of amazing work applying using the design process to solve really big, complex problems like childhood obesity. So Theo's here today to be the voice of what can we learn from other design teams and other movements that have gone before us to use design to tackle wicked problems. Matt Polaine is an innovation manager at the British Antarctic Survey. And Matt is here because he's been working in this field for decades and knows far more about sustainability and the climate crisis than all of us. So you're here as the voice of wisdom in the domain of sustainability. And Kat Drew is the Chief Design Officer at the Design Council. And the Design Council, of course, is an industry body that exists to promote and provoke the design industry as a whole. So Kat's here to help us think beyond service design and think about the bigger scale of all the different design communities. So, we're going to begin by asking each of our panellists a question. And the question that I'd like you all to answer, one at a time, is why do you think the climate crisis is our business? Why should service designers, people in the room today, people listening in, why should we care about this? Want to go first?
Yeah, that's. So, I think it's been mentioned already today that 97% of scientists believe that the climate crisis that we're seeing is as a result of human activity. Within the lens of innovation, you need three different things in the classic IDEO Venn diagram. You need technological feasibility, you need business viability, and you need human desirability. So if we accept that the climate crisis is human-made, and we accept that designers are responsible for or take up the part of human desirability in innovation, then we have a very direct and important role to play in viable innovation that actually impacts society. And that goes for looking at systems change, but it goes for also trying to make an impression on clients, change management, the way that we interact with and design systems for users, the way that we help shape and influence society. I think we're absolutely integral in this answer, or this solution, and this challenge that we're facing.
Welcome, baby, we love you. Theo, why do you think the climate crisis is our business?
I think I agree with a lot of what Rob has said. I guess for me, I don't really privilege designers as the people who should exclusively be making it their business. I feel like if you're alive today, as we all are, and if you are witnessing the current climate crisis and the way it's impacting people in communities in the south, and people whose livelihoods depend on the environment, you would be, I think it's remiss of us and it's immoral of us to not make it a focus of all that we do. I think as service designers, often working with massive organisations who are probably in this room, might be influencing billions, if not trillions pounds worth of spending. I think if we don't make the climate crisis a focus, maybe not the sole focus, but a focus of our work, then we're going to end up designing things that design the current reality and future reality in a way that basically proves to the world who's currently being affected that we don't care. And I think that's why we probably should make it a focus of our work.
Thank you. Matt?
Okay, so first off, a confession, I'm not a service designer, my background is industrial design and engineering. So I'm more familiar with the human-computer interface or man-machine interface element, but having said that, We are awash with a huge amount of information every day. You know, whether it's to do with climate science, Brexit, sorry I mentioned it. It is just too much for us to comprehend and take on board. And at the point of interaction with a service or a product, we're already awash with a huge amount of information. In fact, most of what you're going to be listening to today, you'll forget. Yeah, if you take down notes, you might miss the context of it. So I'm going to mention two words that I hope that will stick. And those two words are the deceit of convenience. So that's the deceit of convenience. Now, there's one thing that I picked up just before we came on here that Kat mentioned, which is about service design's role to provide a frictionless exchange or a service. I would challenge that and say, actually, we need a bit of friction. We need a bit of friction that reflects the impact that we have on what we're doing. And that reflects, in turn, the deceit of convenience. That's why I think you all have a key role here.
Thank you. So a slightly different take on that. I think for me, the service so as Teo said, I mean, we all have a role to play. Everyone has to be focusing on climate action, whether that's through the work that our organisation does or that the actions that we take ourselves as individuals living on this planet. For me, I think service design has a value to add because of its facilitative nature, because of the way that it brings different people together quite often from different disciplines. As we've been saying this morning, there's no one solution for this. We need a lot of different people acting together, and service design can do that. The other thing I would say is that service design over the last 30 years since it kind of came to being has grown and developed so much and is continuing to grow. So even over the last 5 years, we've seen lots of conversations where service design has grown out from transactional services to much more relational ones. And so kind of borrowing the words of Bridget McKenzie, who runs the Climate Museum, thinking about, you know, as we grow, how can we turn from being people-centred to eco-centred design?
Thank you. So I'd love to hear a couple of voices from the audience on what your answer to this question is. Why do you think the climate crisis is the business of service designers? An average answer is because of the babies, because of future generations. Exactly. Yeah.
Because there's a momentum around service design.
Because the momentum around this practice is building, for sure. We had more hands up here. Yeah.
Well, it's all of our responsibility, and if we're service designers, then it's a responsibility of service designers. But I wouldn't restrict it to just service designers.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Keep those thoughts, because we're here today to have a conversation and to spark hopefully a conversation that will last beyond the festival. So I wanted to ask Rob for you to, no, wait a minute, let me think. Teo, let's ask you to go first. You're welcome. So as somebody who's been working in the world of using design to approach tricky problems for a long time, what lessons can we learn from the work that is going before us?
Big question. So I think one of the things that rings in my mind a lot is the fallacy of choice and the fallacy of freedom. So there's a quote by, I'm not going to pronounce her name right, a feminist scientist from Newfoundland called Max Liberon, and she talks about the fact that recycling, for example, is like putting a band-aid on gangrene. And I think when I think about those two things, and I think about the work we've done on obesity, I think there's a way that conversations in the design community start, and there's a way that the conversation in the design community focus on the actions of humans, individual people making decisions that we assume that we can influence. But in certain topics like obesity, and I think in the climate crisis. It's not always the framing of the problem, and the solutions that we present shouldn't only be focused on the behaviours of humans. Often cases, the environments that surround the humans are more to blame for the conditions at play than the human actions themselves. Usually humans are pretty rational and logical and actually making perfectly great decisions based on the things that they're surrounded by and the circumstances they're within. So I guess for me, I think what I want to leapfrog as we enter this discipline into the broader work going on around the climate crisis is I don't want us to make that same framing mistake. I want us to make sure that we leapfrog and acknowledge individual humans' actions, but also really bring into stark focus the fact that it's our environments, our governments and our corporations that are surrounding us with choices that are not sustainable. I would say that if we can do that, then hopefully the conversations will be more respectful for the people currently experiencing the crisis. It will be more respectful for the people who are currently and in the future will be most affected by the crisis, and it will make sure that we address some of the issues of equity that cause things like climate change or obesity to sustain. I guess that would be my broad takeaway from the work I've done.
Yeah, so there's a lot there about framing and context. So for the people in the audience who are thinking, yes, that makes sense and I want to do that, how do you start to learn how to frame problems differently?
I guess this is why the service design process in general, whichever process you are familiar with, is really useful, because I think for me it's all about what you pay attention to and the values that you bring. So I think sometimes it's easy for client briefs to suggest that we should pay attention to one narrow focus, but it's our job as designers to widen their lens and start to expect of them and expect of ourselves to pay attention to more things. And so I think when we're paying attention to more things and look at a problem agnostically, not assuming that we know where the solution would lie, we start to notice the frames that we're putting on. I think as I worked over the last 10 years in this discipline, I've started noticing the way briefs are framed, and obviously a lot of our practice is about reframing those briefs, but sometimes I think that we have to make sure that we're doing that to the best of our ability, keeping like a real strong lens on the things that we value the most. And I think and I hope that the climate crisis is one of the things that we value the most in that.
And on that point about boldly challenging your clients to rethink their brief, to widen their scope, you know, I'm sure that's something that we've all battled with in different shapes and sizes. Like, what have you learned over the years of being the voice of challenge in a room with clients?
I think I've learned it's really hard.
Yeah.
I think I've learned that where money flows, power goes. So I think it is hard to say no to briefs, and it's hard to challenge clients into the point where you know that you're never going to see eye to eye and walk away from those briefs. But I think what I love about the design process most, I think what we're best at, I think Kat alluded to this, is our ability to bring people into the room to find that consensus or have those healthy disagreements. And I think those buying moments up front, I in my practice spend an inordinate amount of time scoping the brief. I spend like little time on the rest. I always think the beginning, where we start is where we'll end up. It's really being brave enough to challenge clients to take that time up front and understand where your values are aligned and not, and actually understanding what values they have brought to the table. So based on this brief, what must be true about the world and what must be true about the solutions that we think are viable. And I think that upfront scoping process is sometimes chopped and sometimes deprioritized because people want to get to the meat. But for me, that is the meat, and I think that's where we can start to challenge clients and help to work together to understand the biases and the privilege that go into some of our framing, and hopefully challenge them in a way that makes for better briefs and briefs that can hopefully start to challenge some of the status quo in the current paradigm.
Amazing, so much good advice in there. So Matt, similar lens of learning from the past. You know, you've been working in and around sustainability for a long time. As you said yourself, not a service designer. So what message do you have for communities like this who have been quite harshly wakened up to the fact that we need to start taking this seriously, we need to take action, we need to challenge our clients, you know, all of the things that we're thinking about. What's your advice for us as somebody who knows about the climate crisis and its severity?
Okay, so I'm going to ask you all a question. How many of you know, by raise of hands, what a life cycle analysis is? Okay, keep your hands up. How many of those with hands up have actually performed the life cycle analysis? Okay. Right, so even if you were to perform a life cycle analysis on something very, very trivial, like maybe a bottle of water, it is incredibly complicated because what you're trying to do is to define the impact of effectively going from the source or birth to death, ideally in circular economics. So you want to have a cradle-to-cradle approach where at the end of use it then is returned back to the beginning as a material resource. And life cycle analysis is a key tool to identifying where there are things that you can change and where there are things that you can't change, because you just can't impact on the whole system. One example that comes to mind that puts a focus on the benefits of service design is how you can use it as a Trojan horse. So I was faced with a scenario in a very large telecommunications company, and I wanted to change the way that the product was made, the packaging that was surrounding it, and also the reuse of the materials used in that particular bit of electronics. And to try and impact on all the silos that eventually led to the development and the marketing and the selling, etc. of that product was too big. So I used system modelling to look at key areas and also identify what's known as unintended consequences. You know, you pull on a bit here and something goes wrong over there. And one of the things I found out was that the customer experience that marketing thought customers were having at the point of taking the product into their house was wrong. About 30% of the customers were actually not experiencing a, here you are, here's the product, welcome to the brand. They were getting a note through the door saying, sorry, we missed you, you were out. And then later on, when it was inconvenient to them, they queued up at the post office to collect the product. And that was the brand experience. And I thought, that's not what they want, that's not what they intended. So I looked at a way of improving the delivery experience, which, by the way, happened to improve on the sustainability of it, because the truck rolls that are taking place would not be so great, they'd be more successful, and also the return part of the material, or the product itself, was easier for the customer, so you can have higher return rates. Now, the marketing department weren't interested in the sustainability aspect of it. It was very low down the score. Customer experience was much higher up. So I worked on the customer experience part, but actually what I was doing was focusing on the sustainability component. About 3 years prior to that, I was trying to encourage the printed circuit board designers to come up with a printed circuit board that was thinner. They couldn't understand why, but I was just trying to be bloody minded about it. And the reason was because I wanted it to be thinner, to go inside a casing that was thinner, to go inside a box that was thinner, that would go through a standard UK letterbox. So what I was doing was looking at key components in a massive supply chain, at different product life cycles, looking at what I could influence and change and add to that influence along the way. It took about 5 years to make a big enough influence, and at one point the recovery of those products led to a £2.3 million saving in 1 quarter. At that point, I had the attention. The circular economy mattered. It puts bucks back into the business. The only way that I could have achieved that was the long game, focusing on system modelling and looking at where I could make the changes, and not necessarily being truthful about my intentions, but focusing on what the target person was measured on, what their KPIs are, and work to those.
It's a brilliant example and reminds me of your point of where money flows is where the power is. So when you can make the business case, it's often the way to get the people in power to pay attention, right? Yeah. Thank you. Kat, I'm going to come to you next. Again, shifting our focus to more future facing, because the design industry, the Design Council is a body that sits across many, many different design disciplines. And I know that a lot of the work that you do there is about, spotting patterns, engaging with different communities, understanding how different disciplines are using design to have impact in different ways. And I'm really curious to hear from you, like, what can we learn as service designers from how other design disciplines, creative communities are tackling this? I know that I've personally been really inspired by the advertising industry and how they have really taken this by the reins and have, are generating a lot of attention and focus, it seems.
So I suppose the first thing to say is there's been, within all the different design disciplines, there's been a number of people who've been working on sustainability for a number of years. So people that come to mind, say Thomas, using graphic design to really get people to pay attention. People like Claire Brass from Department 22, which is a service design organisation focusing specifically on sustainability. Lots of fashion designers have been working in this way for a long time. And lots of people recently have, like us all, kind of taken up the reins and declared that they want to act. So just looking yesterday, there's music declares, Reba declares, 17 Stone Architects declare, Arts and Culture declares, Create and Strike. So all of these people are making that declaration, which is also great. And within service design, there's people like Martin Jordan, DDS, Emily Tillot, FutureGov, and Lisa Stewart-Snook. But I think so that's really great, and there's things like Fashion Revolution, which is a global movement which has created lots of tools and resources about how you can kind of reuse and remake clothes, but also how you can protest. So it reminds me of kind of like what Amnesty was doing kind of 20 years ago is happening now in the fashion industry. The way that Extinction Rebellion has made their graphic design really accessible and open source so that other people can use it. So it's kind of making things sticky so that other people can use and kind of create a bigger movement and not being precious and holding things just for one group. But I think people need to know where to act. Sometimes I want to really challenge evidence-driven policy making, because I think that there are some things we don't know what works and we need to create innovation to then create that evidence. But in the case of climate action, there's very, very clear science and evidence about what is needed. So Drawdown is a really great resource website for anyone who hasn't seen it, about the things that, according to evidence, will really, really make the difference. Refrigerators, creating really good education for women in developing countries. And like also, as you're saying, there are lots of things that we might do around kind of plastic straws or kind of biodegradable plastics that might have unintended consequences if we don't properly know them. So here I think like information is basically what I'm saying is something that everyone is grappling with, and it kind of again reminds me of about 10 years ago, everyone was so scared about information sharing because everyone was so scared to act because they didn't know what the right way to do it was. So I think one of the things that the whole industry needs is information about where to act. Two things I was going to say is what I think all of the industries need to do is to act kind of holistically and systemically, and we've heard those words a lot today. But as Teo was saying, it's not just about engaging systems and their own behaviours. You can make all the most amazing services in the world to make it easier to cycle, to make sure that the shower's at work, to fix your bike, all the rest of it. But unless you've got infrastructure which is safe and cyclists can cross roads easily, you're never going to get people to cycle and abandon cars. So that's why I think actually the Design Council has a role in bringing design disciplines together, and that's in a way for me why I'm so lucky to be at the Design Council. I'm in a very, very privileged position, but to move from an organisation just solely focused in service design to working also with architecture and the built environment and infrastructure like Network Rail and highways in England, so we can really start to influence where those bigger decisions about roads and buildings and the materials that those are made with have come into play. So I'll finish there for the moment, but I think, design disciplines working together.
Thank you. And Rob, so with all of that in mind, so we've looked back the way, we've looked forward, we are looking holistically. I know that you spend a lot of your time having conversations with a lot of the groups and individuals that have been mentioned up here, and I'm curious from your vantage point, what's the elephant in the room? What is the bit of all this that designers aren't talking about?
So much. How do I distill that into a short point? I think one thing that combines all of these discussions is how do we break silos? So how do we start communicating and make sure that the communication across the different disciplines, across the different boundaries that we have are effective and that they're meaningful? This is a challenge that I'm actually working with in my organisation at the moment. So when the satellite applications catapult first started up, it didn't have design or service design as really something that was at the heart of it. It kind of established itself with a few designers who were doing really good work and then slowly getting noticed throughout the organisation. It's now come to be sort of established and recognised for its value and seen as one of the departments that can really grow. But even within the organisation, we're still siloed off, and we have many different silos within the organisation that we need to break down. And as a part of our responsibility as service designers, one of our key skills is facilitation, as Kat's already mentioned. And so I think that one of our responsibilities is really how do we enable the other departments to talk to each other? How do we enable that environment of trust? So I think that one thing that's already been mentioned today is the need for trust in times of uncertainty. And I think that's a lot about building safe spaces. And once you've got that, then you can talk openly. You can actually start to discuss things in a meaningful way and have conflict. So conflict isn't necessarily a bad thing. Lots of people say it's a bad thing, but that's only when it's dysfunctional. When it's functional, when it's meaningful, actually it's what takes you forward, it's what helps you learn. And we're trying to establish this environment in our organisation and positive conflict practices so that we can be healthier about breaking down those silos and increasing communication. Now the next question you should be asking is, what does this mean for the design industry? So if we was looking at how do we create a healthy culture within an organisation? How do we create that healthy culture within the design industry as well? And I think part of that comes down to these safe spaces, creating more dialogue and discourse around sustainability, which I'm grateful for this event, which is doing that. One of the first events to really do it in a meaningful way. Panels like this where we have such diversity of thought and opinion with people from different backgrounds and experiences. And I think when we start to draw the lines and sort of understand what good looks like and sort of explore that space up front and scope, then we can start to understand what the criteria is, what is fit for purpose. And at the end of the process, we can then start to say, did we meet those criteria? Did we meet those evaluation criteria? But that's far more effective when you can put those criteria in at the start. If you're only debating what those criteria are at the end of the project, then you're probably not going to have much in the way of kind of a meaningful discussion. It's more based on emotion and what people's particular agenda is. If you agree it at the start, then you can evaluate it at the end. And I think that's really where, I guess, part of the next step of design is to bring credibility with the disciplines and organisations that are dealing with sustainability, and also to kind of bring those sustainability experts into design and making sure that we're having proper discussions.
Clearly high energy and strong opinions. So we'd love to hear some. Average opinions are also welcome. What did you talk about? Yes.
I'm just
just wondering if this room is just an echo chamber about what we were talking about before, and what about, if this is a silo in itself, and do climate scientists know what service design is or care for it? Sort of what we're thinking about.
Amazing question. Matt, let's come back to that.
Yeah.
Because I feel like you'll have an idea on that. What else did you talk about?
I'm saying service, it's important for everyone expertise in their own field and how we all work together and thinking about problems from a service design point of view. It's useful, but it's also very arrogant. We need to talk to people who are experts in business, energy, ecology.
So there's a need for humbleness.
Yeah, we need to all talk about those problems together. But I think sometimes design comes across as being a bit arrogant, but we know
Absolutely.
more than everybody else does.
Yes, Phil?
Should raise a question about the assumption that, there's 10 years or 12 years or 20 years until irreversible damage to the globe, and what if that assumption is wrong and that it's already too late?
And we had a conversation about that and whether, different ways of kind of applying systems to that.
Yeah, especially because you think about the service design will have assumption. The assumption is we can save the planet. How about we have to live in an unsustainable future? Should we think about it in that way? Because we always think service design should be thinking much longer than the horizon than business person, because they are very short.
Absolutely.
So I was thinking, I know it's kind of a science fiction type of question, but I don't know if it's a value.
Yeah, so there's something there about horizons, and there is a realistic, very rational question of, is it too late? And I know that the work that we've been doing behind the scenes to prepare for this, there are many people who have been very deep in this problem for a long time who would very confidently assert that it is too late, and our problem is about how we design for the crisis that is inevitably coming. So it's important that we look at that and we don't look away, even though it feels really uncomfortable and scary and messy.
Yeah, and you either have the attitude that it's, you could have the attitude that it's kind of too late, or we have the attitude that, okay, well, we all know we're on a trajectory, so it's just doing the best you can with what you have to try and slow that down. And for me, that would be, whether it was 10 years or 20 years or 50 years, I would still have that attitude.
Always the optimist. So Matt, I'd love to ask you to share your view on the question that was asked first about do people who are not familiar with this community, who definitely don't know this event is on today, do they even know that service design is a thing? Is this type of work on people's radars? Like, what's your opinion on that?
Okay, so I mentioned earlier the volume of data that's out there that we consume every day. Most of it goes in one ear, out the other. It's even worse in the climate modelling environment or climate science. A lot of it is measured on papers and peer review, and a lot of it is very complicated because it has to be based around a huge amount of ultimately mathematical modelling from data that's collected in the field and the atmosphere and the ocean floor, outer space, satellites, everything. So it is huge amounts of information that to then present in a intelligible way to each stakeholder would be very difficult. And I think that's where the translation gets lost between the silos. Trying to lump the questions together here. One of the things that I'm often asked is the relative pathways of change in temperatures. That's the climate modelling for 1.5 degree change, 2 degree change time. So what is that about? A lot of it is about mapping probability. And the further out in time, the greater the range of that probability of different events that happen as a result of those changes in climate. So a lot of it is about betting. And of course, we're not betting to save the planet, actually. It's betting about our species. So we quite often sugarcoat the phrase saying saving the planet. No, the planet doesn't have a problem. In fact, it's got this sussed because it's moving into a stage where it's going to eliminate the virus. And that virus is us. So I want to get that right. The second thing is that at the British Antarctic Survey in Cambridge, we have long shafts of ice which are taken from their cores that are taken out from the Antarctic. And trapped in those cores are bubbles. And those bubbles are trapped components of the atmosphere. And so far we can go back 830,000 years. Now I've handled bits of ice that go back 800 years because the really expensive special stuff I don't get to touch. But what is being done there is that the gas is being analysed so that we have a very accurate picture of what the atmosphere was like at that point in time. And then what we're doing is that we build up a picture of that atmospheric change year on year on year, and seeing how fast the rate of change or the variation has been and the rate of change in the past 100 years or so since the Industrial Revolution. It is absolute fact. There is absolute hard science. There is no wavering from this at all. That is the truth. We don't have to make it up. It's there. It's chemistry. And when I see that and describe that to people, are thinking, no, I can't really sense it. And yes, we could have vineyards in Scotland again. How fantastic that would be. No, that's one part of a possible scenario. But actually, when you experience or listen to the eventual outcome of, let's say, a 2-degree change and the cascade of that across species around the planet, including us, it's horrendous. In fact, I'm not going to describe it to you here, but it is horrendous. It's very real. It is happening. It's just that we're boiling frogs. If you don't know what that means, ask me later.
Yes, lady in the back corner.
Knowing all that, how do you keep optimistic, and what keeps you coming to events like this, to help solve solutions?
Can I keep talking? Is that all right?
Well, she's made an assumption that you're an optimist, are you?
Okay, so we talked about silos. Being an industrial design engineer, I kind of cross over engineering and the arts. So you can get a bit further than that, so mechanical engineering and sciences goes to one extreme, all the way across blending to robotics that link to analysing the environment, and then from the arts all the way across to service design, graphic design, man-machine interface design, all those elements. So I have a foot in each camp, which means that I'm probably not very welcome in either camp. But what I do try and do is spread myself around all these silos, because someone has to do it. Someone has to move out of their comfort zone. Often, when I give talks, I quite often start off by talking about imposter syndrome. Does anyone know what that is? Yes. Great. So, sitting here, part of me feels that, because I think, well, I'm not a service designer. All of you are experts in this field. I'm not. But what I'm doing is I'm describing to you an experience in another silo, so you can get a glimpse of what's going on, get a glimpse of an understanding in that space, and I'm trying to move around those silos to make a difference.
Kat, I feel like that's something that you care very deeply about, on how do we inspire and educate and show the next generation of designers and the people who are currently in this practice, like what that actually looks like to be somebody who prioritises spending time in rooms where you are potentially a lone voice and you're speaking a different language. Like, what do you have to say on that?
Well, I've just written down translation to cover all the points. So I really am completely passionate about this. This is why I went back to university to study graphic design, so that I could start finding ways to translate. I was working in government at the time, and the way that you would read information was like massive documents like this, which basically only civil servants would read, and they would stay up until 10 o'clock at night in around Whitehall reading these documents so that you could have something sensible to say the next day. So there was no way of inviting anyone else into those conversations, and therefore the decisions were just made by people in Whitehall. So for me, graphic design has got the power to unlock some of this very complicated data and make it legible so that other people could be invited in, whether that's people in communities, whether it's different design disciplines coming in. And at Policy Lab, we were thinking about lots of different ways to do this. So we came up with evidence safaris, because evidence is really, really important, and it's not just coming up with ideas, it needs to be based on evidence. So we were visualising evidence, putting it all around the wall so that other people could come into the decision-making process with us. One thing that also cropped to mind is a project I did with Ashley Evans and Laura Williams, where we were working with a utilities company and around sewage. And so we were helping translate real-time sensor information about what was happening in sewers to people in the utilities organisation so that they could try to understand what to do with it. So that translation role is really important for me. I was just going to say about some other things that I've noticed, which I think service design does, which other practices are looking at across design. So there's lots of people talking about restorative design. So that is not diminishing the impact of our actions, but actually restoring the environment. So that's being talked about, putting all the good stuff back. And it just reminds me that in service design, we've been talking a lot recently about empowering communities and building capabilities. And it seems to me that those two things might have something to learn from each other. So what can we learn as a service design community from rewilding, from biodiversity? How do we apply that to our practice? Equally, lots of people are talking about reuse and recycling. So making and using old clothes or reusing buildings. And again, within the service design industry, we've been talking a lot recently about asset-based community development. So understanding what assets are in communities and making the best use of those rather than designing a new service. So again, I think there's something that these design practices can learn from each other. And the final thing is about materials and materiality. And Satil Snanaki has just recently written a really great book on this, around materials. And again, in the service design industry, we're also starting to talk about materials. What are the materials of service design? And I'll talk later. Justina Vink talks about some of the more invisible materials of service design, being the values, the power, the relationships that underpin all of the services that we create. So again, how can we learn from product design and materiality in the work that we do?
Yeah, absolutely. Great questions. I'm curious, Theo, on... So we've heard optimism, and we've also recognised that we are a virus, and the truth of this is real. And I know that for me personally, being a designer trying to tackle wicked problems is overwhelming and can lead to doubt, imposter syndrome, unhelpful things that get in our way. So as somebody who is in that context daily, of faced with huge complexity and some very scary realities, how do you keep your energy and momentum and your potential optimism high? Or do you not?
I am a pragmatist, I'm a realist, optimist. I guess for me, there's a few ways I could answer this, but I think I think the best way is to talk about what you're aiming for, what good looks like. So I think I get really annoyed and concerned when we talk about this impending climate crisis in the future, because it's a climate crisis that's happening right now and lots of people are being affected to it as we speak. And so I think there's no way not to be optimistic about a current living problem. I think many of us would have got into this job because we love solving problems, and I think when the problems are current, they feel pressing and they feel important. So I feel like that's one way to keep optimism, not pretending it's a future reality where there's a doomsday scenario, which I think there's many reasons to bring that narrative, why that narrative has pervaded, and it's useful in many ways, but it's also disrespectful in many ways. So I do also think about, coupled with the current realities that we can be affecting, also what we can do using different design disciplines, thinking about speculative design and thinking about the what-if scenarios, not only to halt the continuing warming, but also to start thinking about different ways that we might live, and different ways that we might live today, but also different ways that we might continue to live in the future. I think that can't not be exciting, to continue to challenge ourselves in our current reality. I think that's a privilege of a service designer. We get to do some immediate things for communities today, but we also get to have our eye on the horizon and start to think in a more generative way, a more speculative way about what possibly could be, and find ways to start making steps towards that future. So I don't know if you need that much optimism. It just feels pressing and it feels alive at the moment.
Yeah, I think I really appreciate you helping us reconnect with the fact that this is very real and live and happening right now, and it's not something that we are forecasting or projecting upon. So thank you for that. And it is a privilege to have time to ponder these topics in this forum. We've all taken time away from our desks, from our families, from the things that we normally spend our attention on, to take time to reflect and to listen to people like you who have been immersed in this. So we've got 10 minutes left. What do we want to talk about? Do you have any burning questions for the panelists?
Yes. I had a thought from the things that we've been talking about. We've been talking about this climate change issue, which is so huge, it's paralysing, I think, in many ways. I think personally, I think people can find it paralysing. We've been talking about how do I recycle, how do I do this, how do I not use my car, how do I not go on holiday, and it feels very paralysing, all these decisions, all this plethora of information that's available. And it feels quite paralysing professionally sometimes, not knowing what you can and can't say to clients or service managers who are desperately just trying to keep going during austerity measures, and how can you introduce this conversation? And we've been talking about how do we not sit in silos and just talk amongst ourselves going, well, isn't this important, and not doing anything. And the thing that keeps coming out for me about our role as service designers and not holding on to that arrogance of, I can fix the world, is that our role isn't about bringing knowledge, because it's about bringing our experience of what we've done before, but it's not about bringing our knowledge. The whole point for me of the service designer is to collate other people's knowledge, to find knowledge you don't have, to stick it in a room together, to mix it up, to synthesise it and things out, and to make it tangible. And so I'm interested in what people think about how you can make the big issues tangible to clients without being scary, but how can you make the small changes, the realistic things tangible? And that's part of our role. So I'm interested in how people think we should be making it tangible. Have you been in situations where something hasn't got over the line, and actually if we've been able to make it more tangible, would it have got there, and how can we do that?
Yeah. Who wants to say that?
Okay, so this also relates back to trying to get back to some of the things that have already been said about the disconnect between sciences and design, and this idea of optimism, how to take action. I think my organisation, the CAPOL, is part of a range of organisations that are designed to form part of an industrial strategy. Now, our role is to bridge academia and industry and make sure that academic theory and research is finding its way into having an actual application. That can be a real challenge, and it means that you need to work with often very different disciplines to your own. And so often, you take the artifact of, say, something like a blueprint, service blueprint, it's not the outcome necessarily that's as important as the process. So having all of these different people in a room and getting them to try to make decisions and think through how they're interacting with each other is a really important way of doing that. Similarly, I've worked with a client recently, or a subcontractor that is providing the service for us on a project around helping farmers in Colombia understand their yields and their farming practices, and how to mitigate climate change as an issue and take climate action and improve their farming practices. And we have these two subcontractors that have not worked together before, but have their own products and services that we've hired them for. Now, the initial assumption was that that's where service design came to an end, because they had their own products and solutions. But the reality is that by combining them together, we've created a new product. Now, we have to get them to work together and to find solutions and ways of being more than the sum of their parts. And so what we did is very simply got them to play through their services with Lego figures. We did a desktop walkthrough. And they found from that new ways to work together and new ways to think about collaboration, that they could use the outputs of one service and plug it right back into their own services. And how could they take those outputs from different parts of their system and plug them in and make sure that there's no wasted resource, wasted effort or wasted information. And finally talking about the ideas of optimism as well, and then how do we deal with this? I think that designers are inherently kind of solutions focused, and we're always trying to think about how do we solve this. I don't think we could do our jobs if we didn't believe that we could solve these problems. And I think that optimism is sometimes a bit contagious, at least I hope it is. And I think that there's a key concept in making this work, which is that we need to understand the difference between conditional optimism and complacent optimism. Complacent optimism being that we think that technology or some scientist or somebody else will do the job for us. Actually, we all need to take part in this, and the change will only happen if we believe that we can be part of that change. And I think that that's where design, or where technology is often a real challenge, is that we hold it up as a symbol of progress and a symbol of the solution, but often it has so many unintended consequences that it causes more problems. And actually we've got to really understand that we need to take actions. We can be sustainable today if we behaved in the right ways. It's just that we're not taking those actions, and we need to really think about how we can be part of the solution rather than just wait for somebody else to do it for us. And I think that is...
Yeah, I want to whip and cheer. Well done. It's articulated really well. And I think to your question, it reminds me of what I shared this morning. Yes, it's really overwhelming, and it doesn't feel good, uncomfortable, or safe, or any of the positive things that we would hope for. But we're in a position where we have to sit in that discomfort and move into those spaces for the people who can't do.
I would also just say that this is reminiscent of a lot of the ways that service designers think about themselves, and I think a little bit linked to the arrogance point. When we look at a problem, we always use things like, I'm going to tackle obesity, I'm going to solve climate change. We're not going to do that. There's no way we know that. We need to be realistic, and I think making sure that we know the role that we can play and making it really tangible and collaborating with those who are playing the other roles and being realistic about that, I think is a way to make it manageable for us as a community, rather than thinking that if only we don't gallop in on our white horses, this won't be solved. I think we do have a role to play. We should put our hands in the ring and really commit ourselves, but we're not in this alone, and we're not going to solve it all on our own. And I think if we continue to remember that it's not solving anything, but it's contributing to a future that, then I think, for me anyway, that makes it more manageable and more realistic than trying to find this weird silver bullet that is going to somehow halt all warming and solve all problems that are happening. Yeah.
You're so right, and then my question becomes, well, how do we do that? Because our contribution is teaming up with people like you, Matt, in places where your organisation and different organisations like yours. So what is your advice to all the people who listen to you and say, yes, that's what I want to do. I want to team up. I want to collaborate. I want to go to these spaces where design isn't part of the conversation to bring my skills. Where do we start?
Okay, so let me just pick two examples of complex issues where one has been successful, the other one hasn't. So, picking up on the obesogenic crisis that we have and the loading that has on our healthcare system, I think that the traffic light system inside the packaging is a disaster. That's because it's been, I won't say designed by the industry and by committee, but it actually hasn't really put the point of purchase or the consumer interaction first. And it hasn't really thought about that interacting point. I don't know what the answer is. You're far better qualified than I am to do that. But when I think about that point of making a decision, the various traffic light symbols and how it's misleading, fats, sugar, which kinds of fats, hopeless. It really doesn't help me at all. But then there are other things, which is like all the tunnels underneath London that have provided an incredible transport system. That came about by someone who was an electrician who designed the layout based on a wiring diagram. Stroke of genius. It's fantastic. My understanding of the geography of London is not geographical, it's topographical. I'm often getting it wrong in the location where things are because I'm thinking about London as the London Underground, not as the geography of it. Do I need to know the geography of it when I'm travelling around on London Underground? No, not necessarily. All I need to know is how long it's going to take me to get from one point to another and how I change. So the information that I'm given is just enough information for me to gather quickly when I'm walking through a tube line that I've not been before, I'm having to make a snap decision. How it's laid out is a masterclass in graphic design and user interface design. It's brilliant. So it can be done. When I then jump across to things around the restorative design, which Kat was mentioning, absolutely, I completely agree that you can be the Trojan horses in this. It can lead to the sharing economy, the restorative economy, product as a service, all of those elements that turn around our impact on the consumption, in the consumption process. You know, for example, I was having a conversation quite recently, so why do we need straws? So there's, first of all, it starts off by saying, oh, you know, see the straw up the turtle's nose, huge reaction, and then there's all kinds of alternatives to those straws, but I said, well, but yeah, but is that to get to the alcohol at the bottom of the cocktail drink? Yeah, how important is that? So I think that questioning the service design component that you're working in means that you can look at a bigger picture. You can be that Trojan horse, as I mentioned in the example earlier. And I think that you have a much more ability to influence change than you think.
Well, that I think is the perfect note to end on, because our time is up, although I feel like we could continue this conversation all day. Before we have a round of applause for each of our panellists, I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that Lior has joined us as the founder of this festival. She's the reason that we're all here today, having set the festival up 6 years ago. So I think our applause and joyous whips and cheers should be directed to Lior today. For being such a good audience, for giving us good questions. Our names are here. We want to continue the conversation. All organisations represented here today are also, you know, really committed to keeping this conversation going. So thank you, and thanks again.